Welcome to Our Dream Deferred, a podcast that asks big questions and engages remarkable minds from a wide range of fields to help get underneath our unfulfilled American dream. I'm Tracy Waring-Evans.
And I'm Karen Heller-Key.
We're colleagues working in human services, a field that works in every community to ensure Americans have the building blocks to achieve well-being. People in our field work to remove the barriers that get in the way of well-being, and that means getting to root causes, including the ways our shared beliefs, culture, and social systems and structures make it difficult or impossible for people and groups to ever achieve the stability and prosperity we all want and are promised. These past few years, as our country has become more fragmented and long-standing biases have come into plain sight, we've searched for ways to understand what we're experiencing more deeply and to benefit from perspectives that can help us envision a path forward. Our Dream Deferred is our way of engaging with important and diverse voices and bringing them to our field and beyond. Across Season 1, we will weave conversations into a picture to help us see anew where we are, how we got here, and how we can find a new way forward. Today on Our Dream Deferred, Karen and I are thrilled to be joined by Derrik Anderson, Executive Director of Race Matters for Juvenile Justice in Charlotte, North Carolina. Derrik leads a team of partner organizations working within his community to reduce disproportionality and disparate outcomes for children and families of color. At heart, he is a systems organizer and a race equity champion. We've asked Derrik to speak to a key theme we aim to explore in Our Dream Deferred: who has been left out of the American narrative, and how that impacts our shared values and individual life experiences. Drawing on a deep understanding of the cumulative impact of this nation's history and his own journey, Derrik helps us see the way policies, cultural norms, and systems impact us at a personal, group, and societal level. Karen's going to kick us off with our first question for Derrik.
Thanks so much for joining us, Derrik, and welcome to Our Dream Deferred. We like to start our conversations here with a question about dreams. Your own dreams and the American Dream Deferred that we explore in every episode. So, growing up, what was a big dream you had for yourself? And how was your own dream affected by the state of the American dream at that time?
Hi, Karen. Thank you for your question. As I reflect on growing up in Vicksburg, Mississippi in the 70s, one of the things I thought about as it relates to my childhood is that I didn't have any dreams. I didn't have any goals that were expressed. I just kind of was existing in a moment, growing up in a rural area. And even when I began to think about my educational experience, one of the things that I recognized is I was a student that learned differently. I was a slower learner. I was not diagnosed with any type of disability. I didn't have confidence. And because I didn't have confidence, I was anxious and nervous in classrooms. I wouldn't raise my hand to speak, and I was scared and embarrassed if teachers would call on me to speak in front of the class or in front of other students. And that continued not just in elementary, but also throughout middle school as well as high school. And so being embarrassed by that, I didn't have any behavior problems. I just kind of existed within the classroom and tried to navigate the space in a way to not be noticed or seen. And going through high school, I moved to South Carolina, my junior, senior year in high school. And it wasn't really until I got to my senior year and had challenges being able to pass my EOGs. And so I needed tutoring. And so I got the tutoring that I needed in order to pass the EOG and graduated high school. And then I graduated high school and I went to undergrad at a historically black college and university called South Carolina State University in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And I believe that is the best experience I've ever had and most defining moment in my life, going to HBCU. And the reason I say that is because even going to that school, I had to start out my freshman year taking remedial classes and supportive services because I needed that support as a student. But I recognized during that particular time, and even though being embarrassed that you had to take remedial classes in a college or university, in those small classroom settings where you had teachers that cared about you, where you had teachers who seen something in you that you didn't see in yourself, where you had teachers who encouraged you, teachers who empowered you. Over the course of my matriculation at South Carolina State University, I began to build my confidence because of the support system. I began to find my voice. I began to dream a bigger dream. And that's why I then decided to go to graduate school in Cleveland, Ohio. And then after finishing graduate school, I moved to where I am now in Charlotte, North Carolina. Well, one of the things I recognized over that journey, even through my college years, I've attended HBCU. When I was involved and traveled, even when I would go to historically white colleges and universities, one of the things that I would notice is that there was a stark difference when I would go to HBCUs versus historically white college university, just in terms of the campus, just in terms of the resources, just in terms of access to resources, just in terms of lifestyles, how students were living, was two different worlds. And as I began to think about, even as an adult, I thought about my journey for every place that I lived in. I had been pulled over by law enforcement in every place that I lived in, but couldn't understand it. How was it I moved from city to city, but still seeing some of the same things happening? And even as a person who has a brother and family member who has been part of law enforcement, and even a person who has friends that are current law enforcement, I still couldn't understand it. And so as I think about growing up, as I think about the dream, as my childhood experience, I really didn't start dreaming until college and after college, and beginning to see what is this American dream and what is it I can do to begin to participate as a part of that process.
Thank you so much, Derrik, for sharing that, a bit of your own personal journey and how it shaped you and your understanding of yourself. And I think importantly, what you're shining a light on is the intersection with systems, education, law enforcement, public safety, all the things that are supposed to help all of us live and thrive. So I had the good fortune of getting to know you, Derrik, through a mutual friend, and specifically at a presentation you gave to county human service leaders a few years back. And I remember being blown away by your ability to share through a historical lens one of the policies that have had a cumulative impact on systemic racism and structural bias and impacted communities of color and Indigenous people. So could you tell us a little bit about what drew you to applying the historical lens in that way and why you think it's important to understanding the country's racial divide?
You know, over the course of my journey, and each of us are on our journey at different places and spaces as individuals, but also inside our home system, particularly when we're talking about this notion of really advancing racial equity. One of the things that I recognize and understand and talk to my team about is that I am the work, you are the work, we are the work. Collectively, each of us must do our part to really beginning to better understand and become more aware about the challenges and issues around race, racism, institutional racism, structural racism, white supremacy, all these things that we are polarized to really talk about. And as part of my tenure, I had the privilege and opportunity to work on faculty at Johnson C. Smith University here in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the social work department. During that time, I was the director of field education. And one of the things that I recognize and notice, and being in that environment, is that even being around scholars, and majority African-American or scholars of color, and at the same time having the opportunity to interact with scholars from historically white colleges and universities, I began to not only continue to see the disparities in access to resources that I also experienced as a collegiate student, but now working on faculty and seeing how those resources are challenged. What I also began to know is that even with a lot of those intellectual scholars, those public authors, what you will find is that when we continue to even talk about this issue, there's really not a shared language. Each institution carry their own perspective and values around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Each person and each of us have also a perspective that we bring based on our lived experience, based on our socialization, based on the messages that we receive from our families, our friends, our network, even our education. that begins to help and shape what a perspective is around this subject matter. So even at the most elite institutions across this country, there's still a discussion about these subjects, about these terms and definitions. And so one of the things I believe is important is that we begin to develop a shared language. And having a shared language, and if not, we can begin to use our education, our scholarship, the pedigrees that we have as scholars to kind of scapegoat the real problem and root cause of the issue in terms of the racial inequities that we are experiencing across systems and institutions, even within our home systems on the campuses of colleges and universities. That also shows up in our education system, our social service system, our business system, housing, and any other system or institution that's out there. And one of the things when we talk about root cause and really level setting, what is the root cause? And how do we begin to examine what the root cause is? One of the things that I learned through our education and participation through the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, part of their teaching talks about really defining the root cause is really what are the factors that are contributing to the racial disparities that you see in the data. And also talking about when you look at data trends over time that can highlight racial disproportionality and system level outcomes, particularly for communities of color. We have to continue to examine and ask the question, why are these things happening, and get to the source and root cause of why it's happening to really understand that there's a system in place as relates to systemic racism, institutional racism, but more importantly, it's better to understand the history of this country and the history and laws and policies that have been put in place for years that continue to manifest itself and cause the racial inequities that we're seeing today across systems and institutions.
Thank you, Derrik. You know, the shared language that you're longing for us to achieve across our sectors and systems, I think is fundamentally at the core of what we're trying to surface through this podcast, is to really bring scholars from multiple disciplines and multiple sectors into those conversations. So I really appreciate that. I think we'd love for listeners to experience a bit of how you actually begin to tell our nation's history. Full disclosure, know that I'm asking a lot for a short podcast, given the scope of what you cover in your training sessions. But maybe just share just a brief example of how you bring the story of our country's full history to life, maybe just using one example.
Thanks, Tracy, for that question. When I think about how polarizing this subject matter is, one of the things I begin to think about is how can I begin to develop content that allows it to be objective, but allows us to be informed by facts, by data, but also really bring a historical perspective around social and economic policies and how they have shown up over 500 years. That begins to help us to better understand when we look at the desperate outcomes across systems and institutions today in 2021, why is it that we're seeing that whites have the best outcomes and blacks, indigenous, and people of color having the worst outcomes across all systems? And so when we look at national data, state data, local research, that's disaggregated by race, by ethnicity, by gender, but also by zip code, this is what we find. And the root cause of what we're experiencing is really structural racism and white supremacy. The ideas, the values, and beliefs that whites are superior to others or to people of color. The pattern of implicit and explicit actions and behavior have existed for well over 500 years. And one of the reasons I bring that perspective in here over 500 years, because sometimes we have this discussion that we think that these things happen when slavery began. And so often in conversations, people may say, well, slavery is over. Slavery happened over 400 years ago. Can we all just get along? That was in the past. We're level playing field right now. And so I wanted to bring a historical perspective through laws and policies that help us to be able to see it, to better understand it. So, for example, if we think about in our education system, when we begin to talk about, let's just say, Christopher Columbus and how Christopher Columbus discovered America. When you think about that happening around 1492, according to the research, even in that research, what that talks about is that this country was occupied by people of color during that time. And many of us know that to be Native Americans. So as we think about the land and land use, and we're saying that people of color occupied this land in the 1400s, but if we ask ourselves today, what racial group controls and owns the majority of the land in the United States? What will we say? And how did they get that land, right? And so to understand that, we have to take a stroll back in history. We have to be truth tellers. We have to be truth tellers about our systems and institutions and the role that government played in terms of policies. Then as we kind of fast forward, we talked about the Native Americans. And we talked about just different acts. For example, when you look at the Indians Appropriation Act, right? Creating inter-reservation systems. So we think about that act alone. Or we think about what many people learn around the Trail of Tears. When you ask yourself, who benefited, who's burdened during this particular time? And then we begin to talk about African Americans. People talk about slavery. So yes, slavery happened. When we talk about the first enslaved person in 1619, but slavery ended in 1865. So what you're talking about is over 246 years. And in those 246 years, you ask yourself, maybe who's benefited, but who's burdened? When you think about the jobs and opportunities, when you think about the benefits, you think about the wealth that was passed down from generation to generation. But also let's think about the harm that was done. You think about families that was torn apart. You think about also in terms of blacks can own property. You didn't have permission to leave plantation, right? And you couldn't learn to read and write. You couldn't get married without permission. So let's think about these social as well as laws that were put in place and what was passed down from generation to generation. Think about the trauma that was happening, the health, the mental health. So all these things that was happening over that course of time. But not just to African Americans. When we think about the Latinx or Hispanic Americans, one of the things we talk about just in terms of laws, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but during that particular time, the United States were required to cede more than half of its landmass from Mexico. So think about that, 10 states that was involved in that. Or we think about our Asian American brothers and sisters. We think about the Immigration and Nationality Act. Again, which put in place a quota system that took place. So as we begin to think about that, then you think about the New Deal, that was legislation that was put in place. This was a structural economic highway that benefited mostly whites. So if you think about the act of policies and asking ourselves who benefited and who's burdened. Also, just a few more, we think about the Fair Housing Act and you think about redlining in terms of what that did to neighborhoods and communities. And then finally, when you think about another government bill, when you think about the GI Bill, when you look at this particular bill for veterans, who had access to those resources and maybe who denied access to those resources and who was mostly benefited by that. So just looking at that, begin to ask ourselves over the course of the last 400 or 500 years, when we look at disaggregated data and we look at different groups, how groups may have benefited largely and which groups were burdened. Then we think about segregation. We think about Jim Crow. We think about black codes, convict leasing, mass incarceration, school to prison pipeline, all these things that have been a part of our history that has structurally provided an advantage for one group and at the same time structurally provided disadvantages for groups which are blacks, indigenous, and people of color. And as we begin to look at that landscape, this begins to help us to see and understand the racial inequities that we're seeing across systems and institutions.
So, Derrik, what you just shared is so powerful. I'm thinking that what you've done is to help people understand the ways in which racism is not just about individual bias and behaviors, but is really built into systems and structures. And what we just heard you do was what you do in your talks, and that is ask some questions that seem simple, that are really powerful. Like you just asked, who has experienced the burdens of the way systems have been developed? Who had the power to influence the way those systems were developed? Those seem like the kinds of questions that help people to really see systems and how they're distorted. I'm curious if you could talk a bit about how you've actually seen those questions work. So when you're talking to a group and you see the wheels turning as you're sharing more extensively than you just did, but those kinds of contextual facts and perspectives, what do you see happen in the people that are listening?
And that is a great question. What I recognize that happens over this discussion and conversation is that many of the listeners are beginning to see that what I'm doing is painting a contextual picture about things they may have known or didn't know, and asking ourselves, why wasn't I taught this in our education system? What people are beginning to see and ask ourselves, when I was growing up and had access to resources, you mean to tell me at the same time, for people of color who are my friends, who I like, who I enjoy, were denied access to resources? And there's this assumption that we all are on an equal playing field. There's this assumption that we all have had equal access because we think about affirmative action and we think about all these things. But we ask ourselves, why was affirmative action had to be put in place the first time in order to grant legal access to institutional resources? And so we ask ourselves today, across this country, why do we have states or governments looking to get rid of affirmative action, right? Because there's an assumption that we're equal, or there's an assumption around equity. Again, going back to shared language, terms, and definitions. The other thing I find is that sometimes, particularly some of those who identify as being white, talk about this sense of guilt, this sense of shame. They also talked about how they have begin to recognize their benefit, but at the same time enjoying those benefits. And it's overwhelming not knowing what to do or how to do it. I also began to talk about how this is where we transition from understanding the narratives that are being shaped, particularly by people of color, that it's about their actions and behaviors, and helping to understand it's around systems and structures, policies, procedures, and practices that continue to maintain the marginalization and oppression of Blacks, Indigenous people of color. It continues to provide a structural advantage for whites and a structural advantage for others, all at the same time.
Thank you, Derrik. And really building on what it will take to shift the narratives and norms we're talking about here, and the action that you were just speaking to, collectively, as a nation, what are some of the things you think we really need to undertake to move to a shared, not just a shared language, but that shared understanding that starts to show up in ways that are addressing and redressing those systemic bias and really, putting us on a pathway to achieving that American dream?
There's really been a 400 or 500 year head start based on the dominant culture, right? When you think about generation after generation of what's been passed down, when you think about the laws and policies that our government agencies are putting in place now that furthers the divide and don't bring us closer together. So without having a shared language, without having a general idea and understanding around the root cause, it's hard to solve this problem. There are perspectives out there right now within our government organizations at a local level, state level, national level. There are individuals that hold key positions across our systems and institutions that do not proudly believe that systemic racism exists. So if we don't believe that systemic racism or institutional racism exists, then how can we solve a problem? We don't have a shared understanding around it. The second thing is important that's why the data is so powerful. We have to understand the story and lived experiences behind the data. And understanding the story and lived experience behind the data and helping to bring that into perspective when we begin to look at making policies decisions. The other thing I find that is important is really around this notion of acknowledgement. Asking ourselves, has our country truly acknowledged the harm that is done to Blacks, Indigenous people of color, and have atoned for it? And at the same time, have our systems and institutions acknowledged the harm that they've done and are still doing? So if we can't acknowledge the problem and be truth tellers of what's happening in our home system, that still makes it even more challenging. The other thing we find that I think is even more important Is this work that, as it relates specifically about advancing racial equity within systems and institutions? It's hard work. It's emotional labor. And what I found, and I've been in this work over 10 years, is that it's really around fostering rapport, building relationships, and earning trust. If we can't have trust as a part of this process, then how can we see each other? How can we respect each other? How can we love each other? And so that's a part of this process. In addition to that, we have to begin to also examine power and influence. When we talk about power and influence, asking ourselves, when we look at the dynamic that's happening across system and institution from a racial equity perspective, which racial group has the power and influence to shape the narrative of their racial group and the other racial groups? Which racial groups has the influence, has the access, the resources and capital to shape perspectives around policy, procedures, and practices? And then how do we share power? How do we share power in a way where we are co-creating and co-designing with those who are marginalized and oppressed based on the data? So when we talk about creating systemic change, we have to go to those who are closest to the problem to get the answers and the solutions. But sometimes those who have the power and influence are able to determine what others should have through programming, through services, through delivery. And then when the outcomes are not showing what they are hoping to show, then they begin to shape the blame on those consumers to some degree, their actions and behaviors, right? And so we have to begin to re-examine the whole system and use a systems thinking approach through a racial equity lens. We have to lead with race, we have to center equity, and we have to be intentional about interrupted systems and structures. And finally, we really have to think about this notion of shifting our mental model. And what I mean by that is, for me, like I mentioned earlier, I am the work, you are the work, we are the work. Each one of us has to do our own work, regardless of where we sit and stand inside systems and institutions, at the lowest levels and the highest levels. That means we have to be open to shifting our values and beliefs. And we do that through knowledge and awareness around the problems, around the root cause. We have to also begin to think about the choices and decisions and actions and behaviors that we are making each and every day to ensure that we're not continuing to cause harm, intentionally, unintentionally, regardless of your race and gender. That starts with us. We have to engage in self-reflection, and we really have to engage in shared learning as part of the process to really advance in racial equity.
So I'm struck by the number of threads that you just wove in what you just said, Derrik. So you speak at the intersection of narrative, shared language, and policy. You go to the macro and then to the very personal. So that's a complex and really valuable way of talking about what we're dealing with. I have a big question that we'd love to hear your thoughts on. And I'm curious about those different elements in response to this question. So that is, what do you think it will take to dismantle or redesign our human systems so they really are truly free of built-in bias?
I would say at the core, if we think about where we are today as a country, to put it in context, if we think about what's happening at a national level, state level, and local level, when it comes to voter rights, when it comes to criminal justice, when it comes to education, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to housing, when we look at those systems and we're asking ourselves, why is it so difficult to change policies, procedure, and practices that can create equitable outcomes for everyone? But we have to acknowledge that there are groups of people out there who have been treated unfairly through policies over history, then and now. But so often we have many leaders around our country at a local level, state level, national level, and across systems and institutions that say that they care about everyone. They care about people of color. They care about whites, and they care about everyone. So the question comes from me. How does that show up in your actions and behavior? How does that show up in the decisions that you're making? At the end of the day, for me, it's really around your heart and mind, your values and beliefs. What I sometimes share is that I sometimes hear this notion, and I call intellectual, this whole notion around the intellectual discussions that we're having as individuals or as systems and institutions. We can say publicly what's social and politically the right thing. But then the actions and behaviors we take inside our home system can be something totally different. We can also publicly say what other people need to do to change themselves or change within their home system. But yet we may not be willing to change ourselves or work to change what's happening in our home system. And to me, that's where it starts. It starts with me focusing on myself, and it starts with others focusing on themselves. And it starts with us doing our own internal work. And we have to be mindful to call ourselves in before we call in other people out. And how do we do this in a way that unfortunately we get a lot of people are shaming and blaming? But one of the things that I talk to myself and our team, and I don't believe in, is the shaming and blaming. I believe in how do we gently hold each other accountable and encouraging and supporting as we're on our journey. But we have to be truth tellers. We have to acknowledge it. We have to do the hard work. And what we find, the work to advancing racial equity is hard work. It is emotional labor. It's tiring. And each of us has to endure a part of that as part of the process. That's why it's so difficult. But you also have the perspective that there's nothing wrong. Nothing needs to change. Everything is fine. All people need to do is to go to school and get an education, right? But then if you think about the bias that's built within our hiring process, within the promotion process, when we think about the disparities within pay, the salary ranges, right? When we think about pay between genders. And so there's so many intersectionality and complexity to this that it's not one strategy or one solution that's going to solve it. We have to work across systems and institutions because our systems and institutions are connected. And what our friends at the Racial Equity Institute talks about and teaches about, that our systems are connected at the groundwater, right? And so this is a groundwater approach to look at how we can really move forward. But we have to be in alignment around our language. We have to be in alignment around what the problem is before we can try to solve it. And we have to each see the problem before we try to address it.
Such an important point about being able to see the problem as it exists in the systemic and society, and also personally. And I really appreciate those comments, Derrik. So as we listen to what you've shared with us, I'm struck that you may have some guidance to give to our listeners on things that they may study or listen to or experience in order to build on what you've shared today. So is there anything you'd offer to the audience that might be a good place to start, a favorite book or something that you've experienced yourself?
Thank you, Tracy, for that question. One of the things I would say is that there's a lot of literature out there. There's a lot of information out there. There are a lot of podcasts out there. There are so many ways to access different information. But I would be remiss before I say given one particular author, one particular book to start from, because that would be my bias in a sense, right? But also my recommendation. But what I would encourage everyone to do is to research and find a article, find a book, listen to a podcast, or find information out there on YouTube or other places where you can start your journey. I would say start where you are. I would say also this is an opportunity to begin to say, let's connect with a person who's different from me. And then connecting with that person who's different from me, let me first start to understand their story and lived experience through their childhood. What was your childhood like? And begin to have a conversation about what your what the messages that you receive from your parents and grandparents, great-grandparents, from your family? What about your social network? What about your place of worship? What about your environments? Having that natural conversation to start to build rapport, build relationships, and earning that trust. I would say starting there, or inviting people to read the same article and you coming back and sharing your perspective about what you read. Elevating the places where you agree on, but then be intentional about exploring different perspectives about what you disagree and why you disagree. And based on what you disagree around, not selling the disagreement, but dig deeper to better understand, how is that connected to my childhood? How is that connected to my values and beliefs? How is that connected to my upbringing? So I think we start there at the heart and mind level. But sometimes what I find in this work is that we want to bring people in a room and have a discussion and tough conversation without setting the groundwork, without creating a culture and environment where people can engage and not get staked out and polarized and two opposite polarized positions without working together to build a bridge, without seeking common ground, without developing shared language. But more importantly, creating an environment where multiple truths can exist in the same space at the same time. How do we do that? One of the things I say is that if it's my truth, I would be wrong to say that Karen or Tracy, that your truth is wrong and mine is right. What makes me right and you wrong, right? So we have to begin to examine ourselves and be open to other perspectives as we begin to advance racial equity, as we begin to advance diversity and inclusion. We have to respect the lived experiences, even if it's different from ours. And we have to be a curious learner to better understand what we do not know. I've been on my journey for a long time, and I'm still on my journey. But what I recognize and understand is that I have to sit in self-reflection to look at the choices and decisions that I made to ensure that I'm not causing harm to anybody. I have to also engage in shared learning, being willing and open and vulnerable to talk to others about my blind spots, and having others to hold me accountable to things I may say or things that I may do that I may not be aware of. So we have to talk about accountability. There are sometimes people within systems and institutions who have power and influence, but when I ask you, who are you accountable to? If we're not accountable as a systems and institutions to those who have marginalized and oppressed, then as a system and institution, we are complicit and maintaining a manifestation of institutional racism. And so this is all just a short thought, a short perspective from me in terms of what we can do at a basic level to begin to do that. But more importantly, this should be guided by data and informed by data. We should be looking at data and really disaggregating the data by race, by ethnicity, by gender, by zip code, understanding the story and lived experience behind the data, and use that as a way to begin to look at moving forward. And finally, when people say, well, how do I measure what's happening? One of the things when you talk about your desired results that our colleagues at the Government Alliance on Racial Equity coach around is, what is the condition of well-being for the children, the adults, the family, and the community? They talked about your indicators, just looking at a measure of in terms of what is, and when you look at helping that qualifies that result. And finally, when you talk about performance measures, as you're measuring your programs and your agencies or your services, begin to ask ourselves from a quality perspective, how much did we do? From a quality perspective, how well did we do? And then finally, from impact, is anyone better off based on that? And so as a start, this is a place where we all can begin to start our journey if we're not on our journey, but also begin to identify other people that can come in to help you, to coach you on your journey. But it starts at the beginning with understanding historical and economic challenges that we're experiencing through laws and through policies that continue to cause the challenges that we see of racial inequity across systems and institutions. And one of the things that we believe, particularly Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, is we talk about it being intentional and system organizer is focusing on policies, procedures, and practices that begins to promote practice change.
I really appreciate that, Derrik, and the comment about being a curious learner and listener. I think in my own personal journey that I'm on, I often reflect and say, boy, do I wish I would have asked the 10 additional questions before we moved on that policy. Or maybe something as simple as how I brought a group together to have a learning session and the kind of engagement and conversation we had. So I really take that personally to heart. And I think it's a really important part of the leadership journey all of us are on is are we asking questions? Are we asking the right questions? Are we willing to ask questions and realize what we haven't done before us? I think those are all really important pieces to this conversation. So thank you for sharing a bit of your journey. I'm going to ask Karen if there's any additional follow-up she wants to do, and just appreciate all of your time with us and for sharing from such a deep personal space and giving us so much to think about as we work on the collective journey of really trying to fulfill the American dream for everyone.
Thank you, Tracy.
I would just say that while we haven't had a chance to really delve into the work that you do with your team at Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, it would be great if you would help us link to some of the resources in our show notes, because that in itself is a really powerful story and an evolving story as you continue to test and develop new methods. And although we haven't covered it today, it would be great to be able to feature it, and any other resources you'd like us to share. And then I'll just echo Tracy to say thank you for modeling what you're describing and opening up this space and this conversation. And we think of this podcast as almost a conversation across episodes. And so it will be wonderful to take the threads of what we've learned from you and engage with you and weave those into our next conversation. So thank you so much for making the time to be with us.
Thank you, Karen. I appreciate the time and opportunity to share.
Our Dream Deferred is an APHSA production, hosted by Tracy Waring and Karen Key. Editing and sound design by me, Brandon Mitchell. Our team also includes Christina Becker, Jenny Hogan, and Jessica Guerin. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.